is there a better way? So can we move forward where we can each resolve what bothers us and looking at those triggers? And by triggers, what I'm talking about is that we have these frozen perceptions, these images and sounds and other frozen sensory perceptions that are in our personal space. And each time those are activated, they take us right back to that initial event when they were created. So when we're dealing with trauma, when we're dealing with beliefs that formed as youth, then those reactions can feel very intense. And so we'll be in a situation where we're looking across the room or across the table at maybe our spouse, our children, our work co-workers, and they're saying something, but it takes us right back to an older event, and it triggers that response from that older event. And what ends up happening then is that our reaction is not respective of the current situation. And with so much change and uncertainty going on, we get triggered quite often because things are not the way that they should be. So what logosynthesis does, and what I describe in the book, is how you can identify what those frozen perceptions are using a very structured process that Willem Lammers, the developer of and the founder of logosynthesis, created. And those structured sentences take the energy out of it. So instead of having maybe an angry parent, we have a more compassionate and kind parent in our mind. And when that image isn't there, it doesn't trigger the response. So in the book, I ended up, Adriana did some beautiful illustrations. Some of us are probably familiar with the Viktor Frankl quote, or maybe a Stephen Covey quote, where in between the stimulus and the response is a space, and in that space is the space to choose. And what we find with logosynthesis is that we can identify those frozen perceptions that shut off the space. It's that survival instinct that gets triggered. It's that fight, flight, or freeze response that gets triggered. And so when we end up noticing what those triggers are, and we can resolve those triggers, and again, it's a very structured process that Willem uses to both identify and to resolve those triggers. And when we do that work, that trigger is gone so that we can find the space to choose. So instead of reacting, we're acting. So instead of when our child spills stuff on the floor and we lose our mind, or they do something different than what we believe they should be doing in the moment, then we can actually feel present enough to respond to that situation instead of jumping into and feeling our whole body respond. Because when we get triggered by these frozen perceptions, they're linked to a frozen reaction that is full of emotion, it's full of physical sensations, and it's full of distressing thoughts. And so one of the beauties of the work with Willem is that we all have a ton of automatic responses. We have so many experiences, and if each of those are creating frozen perceptions, how do we know where to start? And we start with identifying what is bothering us in the moment. And so if you think about at the end of the day, you can take a bit of time just to notice what bothered you during the day, what things you responded to that you weren't especially proud of yourself for responding that way. And then you can just go through this guided process. And I have the guided process identified on the Healthy Living Plan YouTube channel. And it's a 10-minute YouTube video that you can just go on, and it guides you through it. So you don't have to understand how it works. You don't have to understand why it works. You don't even have to understand what you're going to work on. It guides you through to help you identify what's bothering you. And then when you connect with that, you can identify what that frozen perception is and resolve it. And sometimes you may go from a very intense feeling of distress to feeling totally relieved. Other times it might be something that will will leave you feeling a little stressful still, but you'll be able to go and do that process again and find increasing levels of relief. And so it really is a stress-free um, way of going through our life. And so automatically, especially in the times that we're in right now, when there's so much uncertainty, when people are reacting like they shouldn't react, but they are, it's how we respond to them. And that's where we find our freedom. That's where we find our energy. And that's where we can actually take meaningful action. And so, with the structure of the book, a big part of it up front is helping us kind of understand why we're reacting the way we do in the moment. Because a lot of times, most of the time, for me, it used to be all of the time, it wasn't me that was doing something wrong. It was someone else, it was something else. And I had to go out and fix it. And sometimes I had a lot of energy stuck in that. And again, Willem, probably no one other than Willem would have been able to tell me this, but he always held me firm that if it bothered me, it was my work to do. And that didn't happen overnight for me. That took me a little bit of work. And as I continued to use that same basic procedure, that same process, I could start to feel relief. And it's very liberating and very energizing to be able to find a sense of relief in what's going on in the world around us. And then we can really focus on moving forward with meaningful action. And for me, if I look at everything that went on with the pandemic, we had a lot of, especially here in Nova Scotia, there were a lot of issues that rose to the surface. And instead of going out and forcing my thoughts and opinions on everyone, which maybe the old me might have, but I was able to focus on not only writing this book, but focus on collaborating with an international community of people that have been working together on this to recognize what is possible and to support each other so that we can gain clarity and to be more supportive, because I can only help as much people as much as I am supportive, and so that's a big part of the work. So again, as you go through the book, you'll start to get a sense that, yeah, maybe the way I'm reacting, if I change my reactions rather than focusing on changing everyone else, I can enjoy my life a little bit more. I can thrive better, and I can be more supportive to others. And then I guide it through that we are individuals, but we're living in groups, we're living in families, we're living in communities, and we operate for the most part of our days in workplaces. And so there are things in those groups that will trigger us. And so the less we get, the less we're reacting, the more we can actually be present in those groups and provide leadership to support the groups going forward. And also, the next chapter in the book kind of takes you through what is logosynthesis so that you can start using it. It's only by using it that you can actually get a strong handle on working with it and feeling what shifts in the process. And then the chapter 4 gives different case studies so that each person can maybe find something that is relevant to themselves. So sometimes when we say, oh, it's one method that resolves anything that bothers you, it sounds a little different than usually we have one issue and we have a list of coping tips. This approaches it a little bit different because it's one method to help resolve whatever it is that bothers you. And so by providing different examples, and it ends up looking at it from the perspective of coaches guiding individuals at a leadership level, at a personal level. It's counselors helping people through issues, and therapists dealing with solving trauma or resolving trauma and helping people feel better. So it gives an idea in those case studies in chapter 4 of what the scope of the work is. And then in chapter 5, I really focused on taking the work and making sense of it in our everyday living. How do we integrate this into our everyday living? And the biggest takeaway for me, and what I feel the biggest takeaway of the book is that when we take the time to resolve what bothers us before we take action, our action is very different. When something happens, especially if it's something that we care a lot about, that feels very intense for us, and we immediately take what we perceive to be action, it's really we're reacting to the situation. Oftentimes we can create bigger issues because we are solving the problems based on a reaction to something that happened a long time ago. And when we can resolve that and we have more clarity and have a better perspective on what the current situation is, then we can take more meaningful action going forward. So it's an important point, and it's one, if you look at what's going on for leaders around the world right now, the more that they can, and each of us, and it starts with each of us, but the more we can recognize how we're reacting in the situation and acknowledge that we all do react to what's going on around us and take the time to resolve those frozen perceptions, we can feel calmer and more focused going forward. And so my goal with this book is to paint a picture of what is possible, to show what is possible when a group of people come together and share their learnings and share their experiences. One of the biggest things that I've noticed and that I'm often guilty of is when something happens in our lives and we're not especially happy with it, we tend to stuff it aside or ignore it, or we kind of blame it on someone else. And it's the support of the group that can help us process it. And if we don't process it, what ends up happening down the road is that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, something happens and it derails relationships. It might cost us our job. So there's a lot when we lose our cool because of something that's been building. It can cost things, or we're working so hard that we're burning out, and there's so many symptoms that we see out there right now that if we have an opportunity to relieve some of the pressure as we go along and we're feeling better, we're not as apt to lose it. So yeah, so that's a little bit of recap of the book. And it's 5 chapters. It's about 250 pages long. It's got beautiful illustrations that Adriana did just to help clarify and illustrate some key concepts. And I'm so thrilled to have those in the book. And also the case studies that were provided by a number of people, Alan and Miriam and Matthias and Annika. It's a global network that's so inspiring to be part of. So take the time to read those and learn and just take some time to explore what is possible for yourself. When it's been transformational and it's kind of hard to explain it because I have the exact same life, which I absolutely love, but it just feels calmer for me because I'm not as active on it.